And so if we turn to the pre-Christian world of ancient Greece, that you've kind of prefigured, you have Eleusis, this city that's, I guess the kind of Mecca, or, whatever analogy you want to use, as this religious center, and this deeply mysterious ritual. And so you write about it being, before we get onto the kind of the potion, the Cookeon, and whether it's psychedelic, is it fairly uncontroversial to say that it was some kind of fertility rite, some kind of harvest festival?
I think there were overtones of that for sure. I mean, even Jane Ellen Harrison writes about this in the 19th into the 20th century. I think that was, in fact, that was the running hypothesis, is that these are fertility rites. And, for those who don't know, the rites of Eleusis were essentially dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, right? The goddess of the grain and her daughter, who's abducted to the underworld by Hades. And we have, like, for example, the hymn to Demeter, which survives from 7th century BC, more or less. And it's kind of an origin tale for how these mysterious rites landed at Eleusis. And baked into all of it is essentially a seasonal myth. Persephone is abducted before she's released by Hades because Demeter is pissed and she sends drought throughout the land. But before Persephone is released, a pomegranate seed is forced down her throat, beckoning her back to the underworld for a certain period of time. So it's used as an explanation for the seasonal cycles, basically. And with that, lots of fertility. When Persephone comes back, it's springtime, the flowers are blossoming, Demeter's happy, everything's fine. When Persephone goes back to the underworld, there's your winter, the death of the crops. And so it's kind of an obvious fertility cycle. And Eleusis itself was the site of this grain, this grain storage. So all the communities around Greece would send their first fruits over to Eleusis for storage there. And to this day, there's a gigantic granary that if you take a visit, the excavator will show you. I mean, so clearly it had something to do with the cereal crops and life and death of the fields, and also with us. That was the running assumption for a long time.
Right, and I think it's the idea, on the one hand, you might say you have fertility rites and harvest festivals, and on the other hand, you have these kind of deeply religious mysteries of death and rebirth. But to me, they seem to almost be two sides of the same thing. Winter and like the wheel of the year is a kind of cyclical death rebirth cycle. So it makes sense to me that there's not contradictory, I guess, to say it could simultaneously be a kind of fertility harvest festival and something of profound religious importance. And the kind of that side of it, the mystery of death and rebirth, I guess that's maybe where the Cookeon comes in. And before the archaeochemistry, we had written kind of evidence of the ingredients, right?
Right, so it's in the same hymn to Demeter that I mentioned. In addition to this origin myth about the abduction of Persephone and Demeter's mad hunt for her daughter over 9 days and nights, she lands at what would become the holy site of Eleusis. And the king and queen offer her a refreshment. They give her a glass of wine, actually, and she says no, she's not a wine lady. She's a beer lady. She's the lady of the grain. And so she lists out the ingredients for this beverage, which becomes known as the Cookeon, which in Greek just means a mixed beverage. But the things that were mixed into it to produce this thing, in Greek, we're left with water, barley, and mint. And we don't know what that means, but if you take a step back, it kind of reads like a very rudimentary recipe for beer, if you think about it, or a minty beer. I talked to a beer scientist in Munich, Germany about this, Martin Zarnkow. So we're not sure what to make of it, but because Eleusis itself is secret, right? And you think about ancient Greece, the society that produces all this wonderful literature, and yet here is this secret mystery tradition where nothing is written down. It was a conscious throwback to prehistory. It was a conscious retention of oral tradition. And these ancient rites, again, for a civilization that now we associate with wine, but at the time, they were hanging on to this archaic beer of sorts. Beer itself, which can be traced back another 10,000 years before that, potentially. And I spend a lot of time in the book tracing this beer sacrament and this religion of brewing all the way from Anatolia into Greece and the rest of Europe in the Neolithic period, which is nerdy and interesting to me, maybe no one else. But the point is, this beverage has a long history behind it. And for the longest time, again, that's all we had were those three ingredients.
Yeah, and it makes sense to me that you know, you're saying for a culture that's known for writing and wine, you have this ritual that nothing's written about it, and it's beer. I heard you say in another podcast, and it's a great point, and it makes sense to me, I guess, that with civilization you have almost a pulling away from nature, pulling away from the natural cycles, but that you might want to retain something that reminds you you're part of the ebb and flow of the natural world, which seems to tick those kinds of boxes.